I am a very privileged man. Bob, you're wonderful, and you know I love you, and it's wonderful to get to work with you. Thank you for having me come. Teo, thanks for inviting me and being flexible with my crazy schedule. And thanks, Stephen, for all of your help. You've been a real asset to helping me get here. As I've aged, I have less capacity for technology, so thank you. So today, this is a grand rounds in the sense that I really want to give you sort of the insight of my brain about how I think about substance use and HIV and how these things correlate in the same persons. So one of the things that happened to me is I worked with Suzette Evans for a long time in terms of doing medication development, which you might think, what does medication development have to do with HIV prevention? Well, in Los Angeles, it has to do with the fact that the people that I would see on Monday would be seen by the infectious disease specialist on Wednesday, and they were the same people. So I learned, because I'm a psychologist, to learn to listen, and it was sort of one of those things where I came to know that these were not different disciplines. These were the same people who were engaging behavior for different reasons and saying different, hey, Meg. Wow, it's really a whole home week. This is awesome. So my career has really been about listening, and I can't possibly do this. There we go. I can't possibly do any of this work without an immense amount of support from NIH. I've had some lovely grants and opportunities that have been available to me from NIDA, from NIMH, local funders as well. And I've also, as part of listening, I think it's important to recognize that some of the people in my ear are no longer here. Ferd Egan passed in 2007. He was the LA City AIDS coordinator, and he was someone who pushed me to move outside comfort zones and to be thinking about concepts that were outrageous. And it was something that I benefited from greatly. So Ferd, a cranky old man with AIDS, taught me a lot. And I think it's important, as we start talking about methamphetamine and HIV in Los Angeles, that I recognize some of my foundational influences. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about epidemiology. We're going to talk about biological links with methamphetamine and some of the new work we're doing, and how methamphetamine has direct links to HIV infection and potentially to disease progression. We'll be talking about behavioral links, about how we might be able to leverage control of drug use behaviors using behavioral, medical, different types of levers to get people to move toward health, whether that's in terms of reducing or eliminating drug use, or reducing or eliminating particularly high-risk sexual exposures when under the influence. We're going to talk a little bit about policy at the end, because as I've gotten old, I've learned that none of my work is important if it doesn't shift policy and how things work on a broad level. So now that I have a big microphone, I actually am learning how to use it. So please give me guidance on some of this as we get to that point. And we'll talk about considerations. I also want to recognize my work spouse, Kathy Reback, who is someone who actually, I can, in my mind, go back to the day in 1996 where we were in Cafe 101 near the 101 freeway, where she was saying, all of our guys who are using methamphetamine, our gay men who are using methamphetamine, have HIV or AIDS. And I was saying, all of the guys who I'm treating for methamphetamine have HIV. So we sat down and had this sort of like marriage of the disciplines, and it started a great career. I went off into academia. She went into community programs and research. So it's been a great opportunity. And one of the things I wanted to start with is to talk about the idea of a social construction of a drug, a gay social construction of a gay drug, of methamphetamine. This is an oldie but goodie. It's still online. It's for the youngsters who haven't been exposed to good qualitative work. This is a really sentinel report and worth actually downloading and reading. actually was the first place to begin to document some of the functions that methamphetamine has in the lives of gay men. And one of the sentinel pieces that came out was the idea that methamphetamine intersects in a very important way with concepts of identity. So an identity as a gay man. So it facilitates sex. So it refers back to the concept of being a gay man. It talks about the concept of being a drug user, about what it means to use a drug within a culture and how that organizes your social network into a drug-using network and into a pro-social family network, and how that those networks are separate. It talks about identity as HIV. So in the early days, before antiretroviral therapies, HIV identity was much more loaded in a negative perspective than it is today. So the idea then was that methamphetamine helped medicate a lot of things: internalized homophobia, issues around HIV infection, or even being a little embarrassed that you're HIV negative. Perry Hilkitis here, and some of the other folks in New York were also writing about the functions of meth in terms of enhancing sexual functioning, enabling sexual behaviors at the extremes that are physiologically impossible without methamphetamine on board. I'm a psychologist, so that also raises a lot of issues about, like, well, what do you do if you become abstinent from methamphetamine, yet this is a major piece of who you are as a gay man sexually? How do you fill that hole? You pull methamphetamine out, you leave a hole in the behavior repertoire, and then you have to fill it. What do you fill it with? How do you go about filling things when you actually have potentially the process of addiction in place as well? It boosts self-confidence. It increases productivity. It functions for weight loss and strong body experiences. It brightens mood. And Steve Kurtz wrote about in the early 2000s about how that the drug actually was helping people who were HIV positive to live longer with AIDS, because it is a stimulant and because the drugs and the disease at the time was really debilitating and induced fatigue. Methamphetamine was a great way to actually bring yourself back to how you thought you were and being able to function in a life that was actually how you believe you are in relating with other people. All of this is important because as I go into the next part of the discussions and data presentation, that this is where people live. The graphs and data that I'm going to be presenting is quantitative. So it's the compiled findings from people who are coming from these perspectives. So I wanted to just spend a little time with that. So just going into epidemiology, we're going to talk a little bit about methamphetamine, the epidemiology of HIV, and the epidemiology of MSM in Los Angeles. So a sentinel report from Ted Cicero's group just came out last year in drug and alcohol dependence that said the opioid and methamphetamine epidemics are twinned epidemics. This is a great report worth downloading and reading, and basically shows that across the country, if you look at drug primary reasons people are going into treatment, you can see that over the past 7 years, you've gone from 20% from basically a fifth to over a third of mentions for people coming in for treatment with opioid use disorder. So this is an emerging problem. And the fact that you see across the population this increase, it suggests that there's something broad happening at the population level. It's not just in the West. Some other data, this also just out of drug and alcohol dependence, you can see that over the past 2 years, 2015 to 2017, a 200% year-over-year increase in the deaths from fentanyl in West Virginia. But look here, what's going on here in terms of, in terms of the last year of methamphetamine use. That's a 100% increase in the number of deaths. It's not just low numbers here. This is really a real phenomenon and is really starting to show that not only do we have to worry about opioids, but stimulants are biting at the heel of the opioid epidemic. And this is our next bit of work, by the way, just so I'm just telling you guys. So if those of you who are grant writing, I would go here. Not me. No, but yeah, exactly. in looking at some of the markers of what's going on with methamphetamine. This is the 2018 NDUS report. NDUS is the old Drug Abuse Warning Network. It's the National Drug Early Warning System. They have a website. They generate email, a lot of email, but it's always worth getting on it because they link reports that are coming out on epidemiology all the time. I like to do that. And you can see here across the country that most of the interdictions are showing that it's really on the West Coast, Los Angeles, King County, Texas, Atlanta, Denver, San Francisco. But still, it's about 22% of all products seized. You can see here, if you move to the east of the Mississippi, though, you're down into single digits here in terms of drug seizure. What happens in terms of treatment admissions? You can see, look here, Los Angeles County, it is tied for the opioids as the #1 reason people seek publicly funded treatment in Los Angeles. It's a huge number. We are under siege in Los Angeles. Texas also has high rates, Denver, King County. New York has a little bit going on in terms of the treatment here, but basically on the East Coast, there's not much happening, which led my mentors to write this opinion piece a few years ago, which I don't think you need to read the paper because the title actually tells the story. But, you know, so Kathy Reback and I, for a long time, have been saying, well, look, what we need locally is just, we need some early sort of data coming in all the time about what's going on the street. Kathy, so in terms of my thinking about epidemiology, I'm always disaggregating. So we have drug seizures, we have treatment demand, we also have street use. And with the sort of the x-axis here is time. Right? So you have people out there who are having methamphetamine use for the first time, developing methamphetamine use regularly, moving into addiction, and then finding treatment. You know, so that's kind of how I think about it. But when we think about what's going on the street, Kathy has a program where she does street-based outreach to gay, bisexual men and transgender persons. So she does street intercept interviews with folks, provides sexual health kits, including condoms and lube and hygiene kits and things that people might need if they're close to the street. And in return, she takes data from them and actually records them onto Scantrons and has for years been keeping these databases. This is from the early 2000s, and you can see that historically, methamphetamine sort of comes and goes. From a 45% here in 2000 to about 25% in 2007. We have a paper that looks out into 2013, and methamphetamine moves up around this area at the point. Marijuana was coming down through this time and bounced here, and of course now is moving right on up because we are a legal state and had medical marijuana for a long time, so there's been a lot of marijuana use. Poppers are always frequent, and alcohol is always the most mentioned substance use. What we have not heard so much about among gay and bisexual men in Los Angeles is opioid use, so we don't see too much of that. You don't either, yeah. We just don't see it. But looking at what's going on in terms of the time that's passed in Los Angeles County, we are way beyond where we've ever been before in terms of methamphetamine use. In terms of deaths, you can see from 2008 to 2014 a tripling in the percent of deaths related to methamphetamine, a high rate of Latino involvement, and a high rate of methamphetamine being used with sex among people who have primary use of methamphetamine at treatment admission. This confirms what we know as well in gay and bisexual men. There's lots of data that have been shown, some from here, San Francisco, other places, that methamphetamine actually significantly increases risks for prevalent STD infection. And it's just dose response. The more methamphetamine you use, the more likely you are to have an STD. And Beryl Koblin in one study and David Ostro in another, this is HPTN Explore, this is Max, were able to show that the attributable fraction of HIV infections due to methamphetamine use is 16% in Explore and fully a third within MAX. So the idea about HIV negative men who are using meth, that there is a very strong likelihood that what I kind of informally call a time to event phenomenon happens, where if you're using meth, then you are very likely to become HIV infected. Which led us to begin to collect systematic data. My other work spouse, both very strong women, just so you know, but we kindly refer to each other as work spouses. I think they would object to being sister wives, though. We've been funded now. We're on our year 6 for our M study, which is a study of men who have sex with men, primarily of color. We initially called it minority men who have sex with men, but Los Angeles is now a majority minority city. So we can no longer say with accuracy minority men who have sex with men. So we've shifted most of our things to men of color who have sex with men, because it's primarily predominantly a cohort of men of color. We also have other folks, Grace Aldravandi, who's a great infectious disease doc, Ron Brookmeyer, statistics, Jen Fulcher, a new infectious disease person with us, a faculty member, Marjan Javanbakht, who's a faculty member in EPI, Naina Harawa, who does criminal justice, and Amy Ragsdale, who's our project director. And what we've seen is that when we built this cohort, we built it along 2 factors. We prospectively built the cohort on one factor of substance use. Half are substance users, half are not. It could be a variety of substances, but we focused on methamphetamine. And the other factor is HIV status. So that half of the by purpose, half of the subjects brought in are HIV negative and half are HIV positive. All right, so what we've been able to see is that in 4 years of running, maybe a little 4.5, we've got 10 seroconverters. It's actually up to 13 now. We have 268 HIV positive, it's 256 HIV negative, but I must have messed up on the slide. The incidence right now is about 2.5 to 3%, and we have 8 deaths. These are young men, 18 to 45, so a high rate of mortality. Okay, I'm going to introduce the concept now about mortality. Okay, we're going to. Hello? Is that me? Oh. Okay, good. I get really freaked out when my phone talks to me out of the blue. One of the things that you can see here is that in spite of looking for HIV negative men who are using methamphetamine, we have twice as many positive guys who are using meth as negative. And we have significantly more negative guys using marijuana than meth, than positive users of marijuana. So it's interesting how that happened. Of the 10 seroconverters here, 8 were active meth users. So one of the problems we have in terms of compiling and maintaining the cohort is the HIV negative guys who are using methamphetamine are seroconverting at a high rate. Which provides us with some great opportunities for biological studies, but isn't good for, them, yeah. Which leads to this issue, we're raising some questions. One of the things we want to focus on is we want to be able to provide a platform for thinking about ideas of the direct effects of methamphetamine on HIV transmission dynamics. We have that capacity, and we also want to know, what are sorts of some of the gut mechanisms that we can identify that are involved with this drug use. So we'll be talking about that. Our next stretch goal is to begin looking at the gut other brain hypothesis. So we're going to start looking at the axis between perhaps looking at serotonin function and different things where it's sort of funny. I've been around psychiatry my entire life, but most of my colleagues are from disciplines other than psychiatry. So I'm looking to pair up with people who are very interested in and have facility in understanding sort of the neurobiology, fMRI, sorts of things like that, because I don't know how to do that. But we have subjects. So we started with this idea. This is an oldie but goodie paper as well. It was by Ellis's group that showed that on any given day that men went into infectious disease clinics, that if they showed up with a positive urine toxicology, then they were as likely to be viremic as the same level as people who are not on ART. So if you are on ART or not on ART, if you came in with positive urine tox, this is not statistically significant. Essentially, it's the same level of viremia that's going on, even in the presence of medication. It didn't matter, however, whether you came in and said you used methamphetamine or didn't say you used methamphetamine. If you provided the negative urine tox and you were on ART, you were pretty close to suppressed. Interesting observation, right? So there's all kinds of fancy biological explanations we could be thinking about, but they suggested that it really had to do more with this question that, meth users are automatically going to be non-compliant with their HIV meds. We all know they're crazy wild animals and can't take their meds. So we're just going to chalk this up to another reason why we should, watch our meth users more closely in the infectious disease clinic. We took that actually as a testable question, and we went to the CFAR and got some money. And we pulled off this study, which just got published. It took us, 4 years to complete. It was a bear. And the reason was because we were taking active meth users. They had to show up in the clinic at 8 a.m. in the morning, positive for methamphetamine, right? They had to provide that urine sample showing that they had just recently used methamphetamine, and then we taxied them to the anoscopy suite, and where we had an anoscope placed, sponges placed, and we took biopsy samples. And we did this for HIV positive men who were using meth and HIV negative men who were using meth. We also had a control sample of just gay men who were HIV negative meth non-users. What Jen Fulcher just published was to show that it didn't matter whether you were HIV positive or HIV negative, but if you showed up with that positive urine test and looked at rectal cytokines, what you saw was a 4 times significant increase of IL-6, 11 times TNF-alpha, 5 times MIP-1A, and RANTES is 6.8, 7 times. I'm not going to get into the specific, like confidence intervals are really large and all that sort of stuff, which they are, because it's a small sample that we had. We had like 30 people, 40 people. It wasn't a lot of people in there, but the signal was really strong and consistent. So why is this important? Well, one of the things we know about HIV is that it's established in the gut, right? So if you have circulating cytokines in gut, and you have that are pro-inflammatory, you have an HIV negative man, and you introduce HIV within that environment, then what you do have is an activated immune system which finds the HIV virus and actually starts the process of establishing infection, because it's trying to it's trying to prevent infection, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. You want actually the immune system to be quiet and let that pass. The antiretrovirals also are drugs that suppress activation of the immune system. So to give people a rest, you get viremia under control and then bring the immune system to rest so that you don't have this activated immune system all the time. In HIV positive guys, this also is happening where you're launching the pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can lead to a blip, or it can lead to other ways in which viral control is lost. This is important because it actually shows for the first time that there is a biological contribution of this drug to that attributable fraction in incidence in HIV. Jen also has an interest in microbiome, so I hope I don't butcher this part, but I don't know how to read this other than to say, you know, maybe it should be on our wall. But so what she did is she took behaviorally characterized 37, very well characterized 37 HIV positive men who'd been positive for 4 years on ART 81%, and then we collected sponges in M study as well. She went in and analyzed for microbiome. What she saw was, what's very fascinating is you see this sort of heat map. The red colors mean there's more, the blue colors mean there's less of these different kinds of bugs that are on the bottom down here. And each of these bugs are more or less sort of pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. What you can see here is that, you know, even just oral semen exposure or ingestion actually causes significant changes in some bugs. But what I really want to focus on here is that this is a more angry bug. This is a kinder bug that has to go with receptive anal intercourse. I use green here because it's also the bugs that are promoted using for marijuana users. And in terms of looking at the methamphetamine users, we can see that these are really angry bugs over here. And she's been able to show that these bugs are different by different sex behaviors and by different drug classes. I circled this one because this is also, this Fusica, this bug here is downregulated in methamphetamine users and is also downregulated here in receptive anal intercourse, which is upregulated in marijuana users. So I don't know, our next step of work within the microbiome is to begin thinking about potential behavioral links. And you know, we can see that we can see markers or biomarkers of behaviors or of drug use. But then the question is, so what? Focusing on other psychiatric functions that link with methamphetamine use, our group for a long time has been looking at the ways in which methamphetamine is linked to depression. And in treatment, what we see is, in other work, in early work we showed, was that increases in depression happen with methamphetamine use and go down with methamphetamine abstinence. Okay, so people who use methamphetamine will complain of depression. I'm depressed, I use a lot of meth, whatever. That means they're active users. If they're not using, they're typically less depressed. What Marjan was able to show in these analyses, which are in review right now, was that consistently methamphetamine is significantly linked with higher CESD scores. These are every 6-month visits. And not only that, it's sort of like, you know, you don't see any sort of movement of other drug use or non-drug users in terms of approximating these higher scores for CESD. This was something that, I'm gonna get out of the biological stuff now a little bit in just 1 minute, but I wanna leave us with one question here, and that is, what does smoking do with HIV positive meth users? Conal O'Cleary wrote a great paper in 2015 showing that smoking in HIV positive groups in clinical settings across the country significantly links to all kinds of bad things, like viremia, hospitalization, other drug use. He really knocked that one out of the park. I had a medical student last year who came and said, you know, Steve, from your first trial that you had with Kathy when you were doing contingency management with these guys and cognitive behavioral therapy, I wonder what happened in the intervening years, because it's been 20 years since I did that original study. So, since we did that original study. So he said, let me at the public health records. And he went and he looked at all of the health records to find death certificates for the people who had been completed the screenings to come into the study. And what he was able to show was that there was an incredibly high rate of death, like 30 people out of 192 who were young men had died, not because of HIV necessarily, but because of meth use or whatever, we don't know. But he started looking, he does have all-cause mortality in this paper, but it's spotty, I don't want to pay attention to it. But the take-home is that using meth actually increases your likelihood to die by a factor of about 4, compared to non-meth using HIV negative general population men. So it's between 3 and 4, somewhere in there. But what really happens is that when you begin to look at smokers within this group, you can see an extremely high rate of death. And just looking at the survival curve is fascinating, because these 2 lines here are the non-smokers. This is HIV positive, this is HIV negative, death percentage, cumulative survival. This are the smokers. This is the smokers who are HIV negative, and these are the HIV positive smokers. So absolutely stunning, right? So what is it that greases the skids to the morgue for gay men who use meth and are living with HIV? I don't know. That's a great biological question. I would bet it's something about this exquisite interaction between nicotine and methamphetamine, and perhaps HIV drugs or HIV or something. I don't know, but that's stunning. So we went over, just to summarize the biology, we went over how the gut, we talked about drugs, we talked about depressive symptoms, and we talked about smoking is bad for everyone, but especially for meth-using gay men living with HIV. So, in terms of thinking about behavior, we did a study in 2005, Kathy and I, we called it the, it was a study that compared contingency management, high-value reinforcement strategy, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for 16 weeks, compared to cognitive behavioral therapy, to the matrix model. We developed this as we went along. This was the gay-specific cognitive behavioral therapy model, which is available online for free. There's a treatment manual as well that can help people to use this. It's at friendscommunitycenter.org. It's very cool. We're just now updating it a little bit. And what we saw was that during treatment that these 2 bars here are the contingency management containing bars of the contingency management plus the matrix model, and then contingency management alone compared to the matrix model. And during treatment, this is significant. So this is just actually the number of clean urines that people provided through here. It could be from 0 to 48, 16 weeks, times 3 times per week. You can see very nice, strong effects here. I think this is fascinating, and I meditate on this. It's sort of like we did no talking to people other than just say, good job, keep doing what you're doing. So that was it. So look how much more effective it is than teaching people skills for avoiding relapse.
What was the contingency management? What did that consist of?
Oh, very good question. So we had a toilet and we had a screen that was on right here. And we had a guy, Art, who sat on the other side and watched men pee. And you would take this sample, put it so that it was visually verified, because it's a high value. So it would start with $2.50, $3.75, $5, and you got 3 in a row, you get a $10 voucher. It continues up to there. So you could earn up to about $1,300. So so we had a reason to watch the pee, right? So there's a lot of funny stories in there. But that was it. And so when Art tested this sample and it came back clean, he would say, you're doing great, keep doing what you're doing. And if it came back dirty, he would say, well, keep trying, organize things so that you're not using or whatever, but just come back, just keep working this, it'll work. That was it. They came in, it was a 5-minute visit. So pretty amazing. If this were a pill, this would be standard of care. So what we also saw was that we got a twofer. Across all of the conditions, we saw that by reducing methamphetamine using any of these sorts of things, we also reduce things like unprotected receptive anal intercourse. It hit on all of the sexual risk behaviors as well. Raising the question about you can modify sexual risk behaviors linked to HIV infection by modifying drug use behavior, okay? So, Kimberly Ling, Walter Ling's daughter, actually took my data and said, I'm a behavioral economist. Let me see what I can do with these data. So she looked at the contingency management conditions and sorted people into savers or spenders, basically looking to see, whether they saved their money or not. So it's kind of interesting that $1,300, the average was about $560 that people earned. The spenders and savers naturally split out. So on average, spenders had 12 purchases and savers had 2. Okay, she didn't have to torture the data. It was a nice, even split. And there's like theory in here about delayed discounting, classical conditioning. So what she saw was that making a purchase increased the odds for the next clinic visit to be free of methamphetamine. By contrast, on the other side, each additional day of delaying reward was associated with a 6% decrease in odds of being clean on the next visit. So it didn't do you any good. And when you plotted this, this is the only graph in my entire career that looks like that. So really fascinating stuff. So some stuff that we're thinking about is maybe, this is post hoc analysis. So it would be very interesting to take this and a priori assign people into spending categories. Either you get into a spending condition and you're forced to spend at a certain rate calculated from the ratio here, or you save and then see what happens in terms of the outcomes. You could weave in some nice fMRI with that. It'd be a super idea. Somebody want to do that?
Sorry, just so I understand. But you don't know what they spent on. They weren't told in any way to...
So we have some of that, but it's dirty, and we weren't able to kind of get there. So Kimberly is actually, we're replicating this in South Africa. High-value contingency management reinforcement program in a pilot where we're doing the same work, but we have much more control over what people spent their vouchers on. So we know whether they bought food or bikes or whatever. We have that data, and this is getting ready for publication now. The cool thing was that we were very happy about this, is that we saw the replication of what happens in contingency management in Western countries with responders and non-responders. There's nothing in between. That you either respond or you don't. And Meg, you guys have been doing this for a long time, and you understand more about what's going on up here in terms of transporters, but it's like, it really feels like this is cross-cultural. It's not just happening here in New York or Los Angeles. It happens in Cape Town, which is very cool. I get excited about that.
Steve,
Yeah.
They use vouchers for cash.
So what we did here is we used vouchers to something called Pick and Pay. Pick and Pay is like Walmart. So, we use the same ratio of the reinforcement to the rand, for the dollars to the rand from our early study. And that's, I think, also why we have a pretty high response rate in here, because the people who are meth dependent in Cape Town are poor. And so really poor. So when they actually have access to cash, what happens is, this has also been shown in some other contingency management or conditional cash transfers in developing countries, is that you make available cash and all boats rise. So, people just will naturally, if you're not like totally addicted, you will actually move toward using that resource in a healthy way for you and your family. So it's interesting, that sort of thing. But yeah, this is all cash. Kimberly's actually working on putting together how they spent their vouchers, whether they used them for hedonic things or consumatory things or other sorts of purchases. Well, they couldn't continue if they were using meth because they would pee dirty.
Sure,
Right, yeah.
You could save it for the end.
Right, exactly. Exactly. They wouldn't do that now. Rafi Landovitz in our group says, this is a great lever, we need to be using it, and used it on a study that was completed a while back in terms of looking at post-exposure prophylaxis. And what he did was he took stimulant using gay men and said, we'll provide you with post-exposure prophylaxis and we'll provide you with contingency management for your methamphetamine use. He used a yoked control condition, which is where you actually take condition in the experiment, subject in the experimental condition, CM, and you and you match him with someone in the control. So this person earns based on their urine, and this person earns based on this person's urine. So it's completely unhinged, but it allows for controlling the amount of resource in the two conditions. What we saw was that it reduced methamphetamine use as we expected, but we also saw that the condition actually significantly increased completion of post-exposure prophylaxis medications and increased PEP adherence, both important markers of outcomes. We're pushing this to look at PrEP, and some thinking now about putting in an application to look at contingency management with PrEP. There are other things that can be done. Stephanie Strathy and Tom Patterson have been showing that if you use active motivational interviewing approaches with gay men who are HIV positive and heterosexuals who are HIV negative, you can see pretty similar sorts of, I only have for the HIV positive group here, increases in protected sex, which shows that you can actually work with active methamphetamine using gay men and help them to reduce their high-risk sex. Phil Coffin and his group published a trial showing that mirtazapine, the antidepressant, mirtazapine at 30 milligrams a day, actually reduces meth use and also reduces high-risk sex in MSM in San Francisco. He's replicated this trial. So he's getting ready to publish this, and we're very interested not only in how this is working in San Francisco in gay men, but perhaps this might be a broad spectrum treatment for methamphetamine. I don't know. Kathy has been working on lower intensity interventions and doing something with theory-based text messages, where I think these are kind of fun, don't have an open source relationship. These were very well crafted sorts of text messages that were developed from active meth users in the gay community in Los Angeles, and organized according to belief models or theories. And in the RCT that she followed this up with, what you can see is that she compared a text message with a live peer health educator on the line, text messages that are just automatic, and an assessment-only condition, and saw that all three conditions reduced active meth use days over the month. But it was actually these orange bars here that led to reduction in sex on meth significantly over the other two comparison conditions. It's kind of fascinating to think that a person at the other end of the line is not all that valuable, that actually you can get more behavior change as a result of just having carefully crafted text messages. Again, back to the brain. What does that say? I don't know, but could be fun to think about. Adam Carrico just published some work and has got some more work coming out on his Artemis plus CM intervention. This is a positive affect intervention plus contingency management in HIV positive meth users. He was able to show positive affect changes that were significant for the Artemis condition compared to the no Artemis control condition at sessions 3 and 5, and saw a significant improvement in mindfulness using the Artemis with the CM, and you can see the different parts of the Artemis intervention, like positive event noting, gratitude, positive reappraisal, attainable goals, altruism. You can see these sorts of things, kind of interesting stuff. I think at this point it's good to step back and remind ourselves that addiction is a spectrum disorder. And so as I've been breezing through prevention samples, treatment samples, community-based samples, we're talking about methamphetamine as if it's a unitary phenomenon, but it's not. It is something that is like under here, there's an x-axis of time, as I said, right? So you have over here people who are not using, or their use doesn't cause problems, and that's the majority of people. And then you've got people here who are occasionally using problems from occasional to frequently. Then you start to see the development of mild to moderate substance use disorder, and then you head over here into addiction and chronic and severe substance use disorder. And as you move from here to here, you're always winnowing down the sample, you're concentrating the signal of methamphetamine dependence, and you have to begin thinking about how you're going to intervene at each of those points most effectively. So I actually meditate on this slide. So, I'm always thinking about, where am I? Oh, I'm over here. Oh, I'm over there. So it kind of helps to remember where you are, and as you begin thinking about what is the question you want to tackle, what is the impact you want to make, and who do you want it to be part of, too. So the strategy is that CM works. It is the most effective tool on the shelf for reducing meth use, especially among MSM, but I would argue among broad samples of meth users as well. So I want to go on, I mean, we have to, as scientists, take this up. We have developed something that is important and that can change meth use behavior. So when people say there's no treatment for methamphetamine use, it makes me nuts. And I actually jump out of my seat. I've done this at the, UNODC when I hear, oh, there's not enough money to pay people to do what they should be doing anyway. That is bullshit. And so the idea that, and then the second one, they follow that one up with, well, when you withdraw the vouchers, the behavior recurs. And I'm like, hello? Addiction is a chronic relapsing condition. If you have an active medication for addiction and you take the medication, the addiction resolves. When you pull the medication off, the addiction will remit, will continue. That's an example of treatment efficacy, not that the treatment doesn't work. So, we as scientists have an obligation to help sharpen the thinking of our people around us who are affected by the emotional stigma attached to addiction. We have some tools in the shed that can work. We need to be promoting these. And I take this road show to NIDA too, because it's like they're some of the people who need some of this education a lot. So, reducing meth use. It reduces HIV transmission behaviors and improves HIV prevention medication adherence, and there's a lot of research that can go in there. There's cross-cultural efficacy for contingency management. There's all kinds of interesting behavioral economics factors and how those relate to neurobehavior economics, which is a very cool field for the basic science people. Affect regulation may boost outcomes. Active meth users benefit from brief MI. Medication approaches may be helpful for reducing meth use, but not abstinence. And don't smoke. That's really. Okay. So in terms of considering policy, so Kathy and I published this slide a long time ago. It's an oldie but goodie, and it's still true. That as you begin thinking about drug abuse treatment and HIV prevention, you have to disaggregate the samples of people that are out there, from recreational users to chronic users, to people in outpatient treatment and residential treatment. Because the prevalence of HIV goes up as you move across methamphetamine use in MSM and these sorts of populations. And the intensity of the resources that get allocated to addressing problems go up as you move across this way too. So here's where I will leave you with thinking about policy, is to begin thinking about how do we begin to integrate PrEP and meth using MSM. Some of the early data I have seen shows that PrEP using MSM are able to adhere to PrEP medications at the same rate as people who aren't using methamphetamine. So the idea that they can't use this drug is the PrEP is the same sort of stigma, non-evidence-based stigma that was around in the early days of ART when we weren't going to treat methamphetamine using HIV positive guys with this precious treatments that we had because they weren't going to take them. That we need to look at the issue of ART, antiretroviral therapies, in meth using MSM, the positive population. And ACTG 5359 is going to do that. It's a ACTG study that is oriented toward working with people who have substance use and mental health disorders and other threats to social determinants of health that interfere with being able to maintain viral suppression. Using contingency management, we're going to get people to virally suppressed and then move them on to long-acting antiretroviral treatment agents, a combination of raltegravir and cabotegravir. So very cool idea. There's a lot of really nifty things that we should be thinking about in energizing the work in this area. Smoking cessation. A lot of my work now is about smoking cessation. Enough said. Mood management. We need to be thinking about that as well as we go to this. And then, of course, there's things we look for. We're seeing fentanyl in LA. Lots of people are dying from fentanyl in LA. We never had that before. People who are not injection drug users are dying of fentanyl in LA. Crazy times. You guys have cocaine here. It's the same sort of thing, warning people about, fentanyl showing up in cocaine drugs. Bowden Nosek did a study for Los Angeles and said, what happens if we do nothing more? And what we can see here is that his modeling shows that if we don't do anything more, we're going to be where we are now, somewhere in there over the next 20 years. It's a particularly bad story for Black MSM in Los Angeles because they will hit saturation in this period, and their incidence levels will become as the same as other race ethnicities for Black MSM, for MSM in Los Angeles. And everybody will say, oh, isn't this great? It's a win. And the answer is no, it's not great. It means that we failed to act when we could actually do something. So the next 15 years, we need to recognize the unique status of methamphetamine. We're doing that. I'm actually energized to do more of that. Recognizing the intersectionalities of these meth users, race, ethnicity, comorbidity, structural determinants, getting smart with investments in monitoring outcomes. Here's one of my big things that Bob and I are working on, and that's to get us to disaggregate our thinking in HIV prevention, to be able to let people who can do advanced medical HIV prevention do that, and spend our money on people who can't do that, whether it's HIV positive, people who can't keep their viral load suppressed, or whether it's people who are HIV negative who have substance use problems. But we need to do both things at the same time. It's not like we need to rob Peter to pay Paul. We have to do both. And then this is my biggest worry, is the current level of coarseness that our culture is at, and horrifying. I mean, it's really, I'm doing therapy with my staff members now because our patients come in, our subjects come in, they are so stressed that they just transfer it on to the staff members. And these are people who made decisions to take lower paying jobs. They're not in business or industry, and they're having to deal with these people who are coming in who are ground by the crease and then transfer it over. I'm not joking. I actually have to do therapy with my staff. It's crazy times. And it's getting worse. With the threats to Medicaid expansion, what's going to happen is our ability to prevent and be active to move resources around to actually prevent HIV infection and to prevent drug use are going to get way, way less. So here are my thoughts about New York. Meth is a threat to your HIV infection control, especially in your MSM communities. You have a strength here that you've recognized this already and are doing some things for people who are showing up, who are gay men, who are HIV, who have sexually transmitted infections, especially syphilis. I've seen some of that work online. It's very forward thinking. There is value in increasing surveillance in the MSM community of the methamphetamine problem, whether it's just getting a sense of how big it is, how it's moving, where it's moving, and being able to think about how you move your health resources around to manage that. There's a question, because you guys have a lot of opioid use here, is whether needle exchange might be a good place to actually mount some of this stuff. I don't know. And then considering interventions for comorbidities, especially smoking, among MSM who are living with HIV. So I'll stop there.
Pretty fantastic. Thank you. We have good time for a discussion and Q&A. And so start to raise your hands. And not to put you on the spot, but I would invite our DOH colleagues, if in the course of our discussion, if you have any comments about what you are seeing at the DOH or what's being looked at or monitored around, particularly these last statements that Steve made. Go ahead, Matt.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I work for the New York City Department of Health. We actually have a program for folks who are using methamphetamine, mostly HIV negative and HIV positive MSM. My question was, have you studied the barriers to using contingency management in community-based organizations? You know, what does it look like when it goes from the lab to the...
Great question. So it actually transfers very easily. So this has more to do with your public health colleagues than the people on the street. So Kathy Reback has had for about 8 years now, maybe 9 years, it's funded through, not through the Substance Abuse Prevention and Control Division of our public health department. It's funded through HIV and STD programs. She has a low value contingency management plus the gay-specific cognitive behavioral therapy intervention that she runs. And it has been going on for many years. Also, we moved it into San Francisco Public Health Department. That was adopted there. San Francisco AIDS Foundation took it over. It's morphed a little bit, so it's called Project Prop. There's some papers on it. Happy to give you those papers and show you how it works. What they did is they moved it. So Kathy's in a community setting, right? San Francisco moved it to be the front door to treatment. So, because what happens is if you get people to start being clear of methamphetamine for a period, what happens is they go, oh, geez, I really have made a mess of my life. And so they really, the typical move is then not to, be, oh, phew, glad that's over. It's more of I think I need to come in and learn some skills about how to put my life back together and get my life back. And by the way, that's the words they use, get my life back. So the issue of how you do that is really not limited by the community. It's effective. You can, as you said, you've segmented the group that you want this to happen in, so it's cost effective in terms of infections avoided. So you're not going to get money back for it, but you're not going to be paying money for treatment. And you're making a difference. But it really has nothing to do with the community. This has to do with policy.
So just can I throw kind of a bidirectional or multi-directional treatment is an opportunity to get other kinds of treatments in place. We're starting to see emerging evidence of PrEP implementation and scale up of particularly young people of interjecting tobacco use and other chronic diabetes screening. And so I'm just thinking the platform of PrEP also as an opportunity to really address meth prevention.
That's a great idea. I mean, I will tell you, I was meditating on this morning. Is it that, with methamphetamine, I've long ago went away from saying, it's okay if you use a little meth. I don't say that anymore. I used to be schooled by my community colleagues to say, I do it every 3 months, and I'd be going, okay. And then my community colleague would be calling me up and say, hey, Steve, can I see you? And, and that happened again and again and again and again. So I no longer think there's a safe level of methamphetamine use. So that could be something that could be brought in as a monitor sort of thing. If you're using meth, it's a tick box. Okay, that's a problem, right?
Bruce. Just for the others in the room, Steve knows me. I'm Bruce Shackman, as well. Medical college, sorry. I was really struck by your comment. If this was a drug, it would be standard of care.
Yes.
And even the cost element, even with $1,000 or whatever it was for 12 weeks, the PrEP is $12,000 for a year. It's not that order of magnitude at all.
Oh,
medication, right?
God.
So how?
That's good.
How do we? And there's obviously stigma and biases around paying people to do things. So how do we, in the research field, try to address that in the policy field? Ideally we'd like Medicaid to pay for it, right? So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that. I was struck by the research about how are people spending the money, which I think, there's this bias, well, if they're spending it on some other drug, that would be a bad thing. Well, not necessarily, but I'm sure that there's interest in how the money is being spent. Is there body of research around that or not? Okay,
so 2 parts. One is the VA actually has adopted contingency management for cocaine use disorder. Nancy Petrie, God love her, made that happen. And you know how it happened? She made it happen. A woman not to be crossed. She made that happen. She is the reason why that happens. We have to have champions who make this stuff happen. Because this is not about data. It's about emotion and stigma. So we have to have people who are willing to go out to the front line and say, yes, I know about the religious, all the stuff that you're thinking in your head, but this is how it works. If this were a drug, it would be a standard of care. You may have family members who are affected by this disease. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're lucky. But for them, they deserve a shot at this. That sort of emotion-based sort of policy communiques we have to do. And in terms of what people are spending their money for, Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and we're collecting some data on that. I would hope that some of my contingency management colleagues would be doing something like that as well. It's kind of rare to see the marriage of behavioral economics with contingency management. It happens to me because I have mentored a colleague, but I think it's a very rich area, and my hunch is that what at least we've seen in South Africa is that people first feed themselves and then move from there to other things. So the idea about addiction being a downward drift in socioeconomics sort of is true here as well, and people will do the same sort of thing. They'll feed, they'll get themselves back into health, and then they'll start doing other things, which are generally pretty pro-social. But it'd be good to have a data set.
There's actually an interesting study where a foundation is funding it, and it's a very large national sample, to improve the health and well-being of young children by giving the parents a monthly stipend of either $20 a month or $300 a month, and following the children very closely to see if at age 3 their fMRIs are different, their health. And so, and they track what the money is spent on. So I think there's information in other fields that might be of interest.
That's excellent.
So that's really great, Steve. I'm so happy I came to this. So I'm really, really interested in tobacco smoking and nicotine and the impact on a lot of behaviors. And so, I have some really intriguing data with daily marijuana smoker type study, not at all related to your work, but cigarette smoking predicts more than anything else their relapse to marijuana use. So cigarette smoking predicts poor drug treatment outcome across all drugs of abuse. Because you think about, cigarette smoking is so socially frowned upon. Very few people now in the country are cigarette smoking except drug users. They're,
right.
Enormous across all drugs. And so what I'm so interested in is whether it's a marker of something or if there's a biological component to it. And I think it's probably a combination therein, but I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I really am intrigued that your cigarette smoking in your population predicts worse outcome across the board too. And so what I'd be so curious to see is if you're successful in getting them to stop cigarette smoking, if that improves things, or if it's a marker for risky behavior, delay discounting, all sorts of other things. If quitting smoking will be enough. I'm curious. I hope it is. But
it's a good question.
I just wonder if you could keep an eye on that when you do your tobacco cessation, if it does shift other behaviors or if it's more a marker of risk taking and so forth.
That's a great question.
I didn't announce it at the beginning, but go ahead, Tayo. We have an upcoming rounds. Go ahead.
March 14, Robert Gross will talk about smoking and HIV.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
March 14th
Nice.
here. Robert Gross is from UPenn. He's doing a business at
Nicotine metabolism ratio guy.
So if you can come to that one, that'd be great.
That would be good. I've read his stuff. I want to do something with that. But your question's a good one. I don't know. And that's you just clarified some thinking for me about the next projects I can write with TRDRP. So we have a California foundation that funds, from the Tobacco Tax Initiative, it funds research. So maybe want to be a part?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tremendous. So just on the implementation end of things, first of all, I'm wondering, so in methadone treatment, the contingency management, if you think of the take-home doses and contingency management.
Kind of grew out of that, yeah.
Widespread adopted. Are there any lessons there about how the systems that deliver methadone were able to embrace take-home contingency management that we can transfer to meth treatment, to other outcomes?
Well, it was Maxine who did all that, right? Maxine Stitzer, who started that whole body of work with Martin Noguchi and George Bigelow, and that whole Baltimore group started that very careful study of methadone and contingency management. I'm going to come back to the same thing I said. We have to have some we have to have some real champions from among us. I mean, more than ever, this is not about data. It's about a story. And we have to tell a story. Nobody cares about our data. We care about our data, but nobody else does. All that happens is you tell a story. And if they don't buy it, you say it louder. But I mean, it's unfortunate that my work has shifted to that. But that's all I do now, is go and I bring slides. Nobody's interested, but they want to hear about, how this works and how do I deal with the opposition from my peers who are going to hate this idea, and they're going to think I'm an idiot because I'm paying people to do something they should do anyway. So we as a system have to organize. I'm not quite sure what we need to do.
So
but
what's the FDA equivalent of approving a treatment that's not a drug?
Well, there was an article in Psychiatric News this week about that there are over 10,000 apps now for mental health purposes. And if you could link it as an app, the FDA doesn't review it unless it's specific for a disorder. And if it is specific, there's a fast track.
We want some agency that says it's approved, like this works. I'm approving it. I'm looking for not the FDA, but some other agency to say, like the CDC. I mean, I don't know where that.
No, I think it's a good question. My own thought would be if you could get Aetna or Blue Cross to pay for it, then maybe. I mean, there's data from Australia that shows that 5 years after rehab, you look the same as no treatment. So if you're paying $50,000 a month for an expensive rehab spot for somebody to go into, and 5 years down the road, you're looking at, the same thing you're looking at now, why not spend $1,500?
They don't pay. Residential treatment is a whole other problem, but it's very hard to get any insurance to cover it.
Isn't Kaiser Permanente pretty forward-thinking in some of these things?
They are.
I mean, I think I'm Jennifer Carmona with Meth.
Oh, yeah, hey.
What brings the insurance angle is what I was thinking of as well, because there's some, delivery system reform efforts underway, certainly in New York State now, where managed care companies, I think, are very active in testing out different approaches. And, I can think of a couple of HIV special needs plans in New York State now that might be interested in an approach like this.
Cool.
In a former clinical role, I actually worked with a lot of meth users in the city. And one of the things that always came up, and when you have this diagram about addiction and when it's not problematic or things like that, I remember with a lot of clients I used to work with that the graduation to injection really sort of pushed someone on that spectrum to when they deem this, I need to do something about this. It was really almost traumatic for them. A lot of the times they didn't predict that that was going to be the first time that they injected. And so it actually was a really big way that we were actually able to get them into formal treatment. And so, and of course the risk profile for someone who's just smoking as opposed to someone who's injecting much more frequently is very big. So I'm wondering if there is any sort of research that you're doing, or if that you might be looking at specific people who only use traditionally in this way, or even trying to prevent this sort of graduation.
So across all our clinical trials, the only thing that predicts outcome is severity of the disorder, how much you use, how many days out of the 30 days prior to treatment that you use. That's the only thing that will predict. Injectors, non-injectors, doesn't matter. So you're right about the infectious disease risk profile is very much exaggerated in injectors, but in terms of predicting who's going to do better in treatment, doesn't predict.
I was struck by your savers versus spenders finding, and then the experiment you proposed, which of course you can answer empirically. But the concern I had thinking about that is you don't know the nature of why they're savers or spenders. And so forcing one into a category, I would be pessimistic that would be the way to do it, but I don't know. So
I'll give you a page out of why we're going that way. One reason is because when I give a specific that piece of the work, one of the things we talk about is that that it's not the saving, it's not the earning of the voucher that makes the dopamine flow, it's the redeeming of the voucher. It's sort of like when you go and do retail therapy, it's not putting things in the cart that is reparative, it's swiping the card as you walk out the store. You know, it's like, so this is what happens in terms of, in neurobehavioral economics, is that this incentive piece is making dopamine flow. And so that takes us back to behavior therapy principles, back to Skinner, about how you want to have the reinforcement being delivered close to the behavior you want to reinforce. So that's the behavioral explanation. The neurobiological is that you've then got more dopamine flowing regularly, so that you're upregulating mood, you're upregulating good decision making. You have maybe addressed some part of the imbalance in dopamine tone by redeeming a voucher.
So one of the things, like between the savers and the spenders, it's almost sort of like the flip side of what you would want.
Yeah.
Using delayed discount.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two things?
That's a great question, and that could be another study to look at. But one of the things you have to think about is, even if you get somebody who has like 4 months of clean time from methamphetamine dependence, those of us who are clinically trained knows that it's not over at that point. They may be continuing the next couple months, and they're not using meth, but they're making stupid decisions. Like, they're not taking care of warrants. They're not making sure that they've, showed up for work on time. They haven't repaired their relationships. They're like, they continue to have the delayed discount operating in the long term. It's just not about the drug use any longer. So I think that the issue of delayed discount is related to the drug as it relates to the methamphetamine use, but as it relates to addiction, it's a larger set of bad decisions that are made in lieu of short-term experiences. So that's kind of where my thinking is. I think that I don't know how that shifts over time, or if it shifts, or people just get compensatory in terms of being able to manage the delay. I don't know, but it's a great question.
Has there been any work where you would actually take away the condition? So, like, I'm thinking there's like a lot of, like, from the social protections point of view, you could also just offer a cash transfer, and that might help people take care of all these other things that are maybe causing the drug use to begin with. And then you take away, some of the administrative costs of having to monitor their drug use. I'm just curious, has there been any work in that area?
We got as close to that as you can come with the, peeing for dollars.
So they were being paid to pee, but not for the result?
No, they were being paid for the result.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right, but you could also just pay them to pee, and then you would give them the result each day and say, good job. Or,
yeah, you could. Yeah, you could. And in people who are really poor, that might be enough. But for people who have a lot of the disorder, it's not going to be enough.
Okay, one more.
Oh, I was going to say, do you think related to that part of that is this like affirming message that you're giving people, where it's like, you're not telling them like, okay, well, I see that you tested positive this time. It's really important that you stop, it's like, you may be the one group that's giving people this affirming message of like, you're doing the right thing. I can see you're trying hard, even though you weren't successful this time, that's kind of enmeshed in that contingency management.
There's a whole line of work that Kevin Volp is doing around using contingency management with smoking in large health systems that is disaggregating that question. And what he's been able to show is that, if you incentivize people to quit smoking, that's great. It works better than if you actually pay their health insurance. They like getting money, right? But if you actually incentivize the clinician, the physician who's treating them, and incentivize the physician to help that person to quit smoking, then you boost the outcome rates for the participant. So it is something about not only the incentive, but how the incentive is delivered and who delivers the incentive that can actually be pretty powerful in eliciting the behavior change.
And we want to thank you for a really fantastic morning.